When Hitler became dictator of Germany, he applied the principle he wrote in his book, Mein Kampf. A stronger race will drive out the weak races, for the vital urge crushes the weak to make room for the strong. How did Hitler manage to take power and become the supreme leader of Germany, the Führer? To tell this story, the best footage of the rise of Adolf Hitler has been painstakingly transformed using digital techniques into color. To ask the question, how was the Hitler phenomenon possible? Nuremberg, 1929. This Nazi Party rally was the real beginning of what German playwright Bertolt Brecht called the resistible rise of Adolf Hitler. The devastating economic crisis originating with the Wall Street crash in the United States caused havoc throughout the world, particularly in Germany. One after another, factories closed their doors, and the number of unemployed reached the astounding figure of 6 million. Out of despair, many Germans turned to the Nazis or to the communists, who also had their paramilitary troops, complete with uniforms. Communists and Nazis clashed violently in all the elections that followed. Hitler provoked disorder, while at the same time claiming to be the only man capable of stopping it. This tactic proved effective. Hitler rallied the small business owners and homeowners to his cause by denouncing the threat of the Red Plague, the egalitarian Marxists, who also struck fear into the hearts of the peasantry. The result? 100 elected Nazis entered the Reichstag, the German parliament. Hitler was now the leader of the country's second political party, after the Social Democrats. Yet the upper classes who despised Hitler weren't particularly worried. They carried on living a lifestyle isolated from the mass of the German people. They saw no reason why things should change. And in the meantime, Hitler's rise continued. In just a year, he came to dominate the extreme right in Germany. Veterans associations, such as the Steel Helmets, with 500,000 members, agreed to obey his orders. Behind his domineering posturing, Hitler hid a terrible secret. He had just emerged from a scandal which might have finished him. Rumors of a personal drama were circulating in the press. He had developed a passion for his own niece, Gaily Raubal, aged 23. He loved her irrationally, possessively. And she had just committed suicide. She had been living with him in his Munich apartment. She confided to a friend, "My uncle is a monster. No one can imagine what he demands of me." She apparently wanted to leave him, but now she was dead. A press campaign was launched against Hitler, accusing him of sexual perversion and even of having Gailey murdered. Extremely depressed, Hitler threatened to kill himself as well. His worried entourage decided to act. His photographer, Heinrich Hoffmann, introduced him to one of his secretaries. She resembled Gailey. Her name was Eva Braun. She was 19 and already quite worldly. She seemed to fit the bill. She was captivated by the popularity of the Nazi party leader. Hitler would make her his new shadow mistress. He declared himself a bachelor married to Germany to gain the sympathy of female voters. German women already had the right to vote. Eva Braun was above all a sports enthusiast. She dreamt of becoming an actress and of starring in Tarzan movies in Hollywood. With her behind him, Hitler recovered his combativeness as a politician at a time when the end of the mandate of Germany's President Hindenburg was drawing near. Hitler was among the candidates to succeed him in 1932. Barely 10 years after his attempted putsch and imprisonment, Hitler was on the verge of becoming president of Germany. Germans were subjected to an intensive poster campaign. Nazi propaganda chief Joseph Goebbels said, "Let us be grandiose." He devised an ultra-modern election campaign using aeroplanes, a European first. The largest commercial plane of the time was provided by the director of Lufthansa Airlines, who wasn't adverse to this free advertising opportunity. Hitler, wearing a leather helmet, embarked on a tour of 100 German towns to gauge his popularity. Goebbels invented the slogan, "The Führer above Germany." He forged the myth of Hitler as the supreme savior during these aerial hustings, carefully filmed and then screened all over the country. But Goebbels could not relax yet. The campaign cost a fortune, and the industrial barons were still wary of Hitler's violent methods. The Nazis had to charge everyone who came to listen to Hitler the equivalent of a £1 entry fee. This didn't discourage people. On the contrary. One witness described his reaction. "I suddenly felt Hitler's eyes on me, and it affected me for the rest of my life." A week before the presidential elections, Hitler brought together 100,000 Berliners sick of the traditional parties, who appeared incapable of solving the crisis. 20-year-old Jutta Rüdiger was in the crowd. She wrote, "I can't explain the state that unemployment plunged us into. We really thought that Hitler alone could get us out of that misery."
Wir reden nicht von den Zehntausenden, die Jahr für Jahr den Gashahn aufdrehen, nicht weil es ihnen zu gut geht.
To the amazement of many, Hitler became a serious candidate for the presidency. The press had a field day. On the right, Hitler was seen as the modern political hero. On the left, the insults were more personal. Hitler was described as a pansy, a half-mad cheater, a vain charlatan, a fake tough guy with an oversized riding crop. The outgoing president, Marshal Hindenburg, although a reactionary monarchist, was supported by the left. On the 10th of April 1932, the verdict was announced. Hitler had been defeated. 13 million Germans had voted for him, a third of the electorate. Support for him was enormous, but not enough. April 1932. Hindenburg has been re-elected as President of Germany thanks to the Social Democrats. But he wanted to be free of his dependence on them, so he called a new election. And Hitler, continuing his resistible rise, started campaigning again. As he gave up to 5 speeches a day, his entourage was reeling. One of his associates said, "We were like seconds who have to get their boxer back into shape between rounds." But Hitler fed off the crowds. He was carried away by his own virulent oratory.
Die Gegner werfen uns Nationalsozialisten vor und mir insbesondere, dass wir intolerante, unverträgliche Menschen seien. Wir wollten, sagen sie, mit anderen Parteien nicht arbeiten. Die Herren haben ganz recht. Wir sind intolerant. Ich habe mir ein Ziel gestellt, nämlich die 30 Parteien aus Deutschland hinauszufegen.
For Hitler, the first party to eliminate in the 1932 election campaign was the Communist Party. The stormtroopers were given the task. They were now 400,000 strong. They financed themselves, paying for their own uniforms and equipment. They hated the humiliations of the Versailles Treaty and believed that only Hitler would stand up and build a new Germany. There was great companionship and solidarity among the men who formed the SA legions. Goebbels invented an idol to inspire them, Horst Wessel, a petty crook from Berlin who had become leader of an assault brigade. Killed by the communists a year earlier, he was now made into a martyr for the Nazis. Speaking at his elaborate funeral ceremony, Goebbels compared this man's sacrifice to Christ's. He commissioned music for what he called the last poem of the dead SA member and made it the official anthem of the Nazi Party. The Horst Wessel Lied, the song of Horst Wessel, the credo of violence. The Red Front were the communist militias. They always wore workers' caps and Russian blouses. All these militants, men and women, were inspired by their socialist ideals. July 1932, the bloody summer of the election campaign. The SA stormtroopers, with the complicity of the police, provoked street battles with the communists. 100 dead and 1,000 wounded was the toll among the communists. Many Germans, exhausted by the disorder and the government's powerlessness, approved of the Nazis' violent acts. The result, 230 Nazis were elected to parliament. Hitler was now leader of the country's strongest political party. Power was within his reach for the first time. Quickly, however, euphoria gave way to disappointment. President Hindenburg refused to name him Chancellor, head of the government. Hindenburg told Hitler, "Before God, my conscience, and the fatherland, I cannot hand over power to a party as intolerant as yours. Nevertheless, Hindenburg offered him a role in the government. But Hitler didn't consider himself an ordinary politician seeking a ministerial post. He wanted all the power to establish a totalitarian state. In a few weeks, Goebbels, the head of the vast Nazi parliamentary group, was able to paralyze democratic procedure. No majority could be formed. Then Goebbels, smiling his malicious smile, announced, "It's high time to dissolve this assembly, which no longer reflects the will of the people." Yet another election was called, the third within a year. It would take place in November. Hitler saw it as another chance to make gains.
Die Energie und die Zähigkeit gehabt, von den damaligen 1000 Mann vor 10 Jahren bis heute 14 Millionen zu machen. Und ich werde aus den 14 Millionen die 20 und die 30 Millionen machen.
The election results were a crushing disappointment for Hitler. Surrounded by his personal SS guard, he brooded over his failure. He had lost 2 million voters and 40 seats. Goebbels said, "We've had a setback." Hitler refused to enter the government, and the voters didn't understand why. With bitterness, Goebbels read the foreign press reports. The London Daily Herald wrote, "Hitlerism as a political force is dead." The French daily Le Populaire, edited by an eminent socialist, wrote about the end of Hitler. But they were wrong. 3 months later, Hindenburg, still facing the impossibility of forming a majority, finally named Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. To achieve his end, the wolf had disguised himself as a lamb. Hitler reassured Hindenburg by asking for only 2 ministerial portfolios for the Nazis. For the Ministry of the Interior to go to a Munich policeman named Wilhelm Frick, with Hermann Göring at his side, also to control the police. 2 key positions. Hitler advanced by subterfuge. His aim was to show that the most important ministerial positions had gone to a conservative, Franz von Papen, a former chancellor, and to the strongman of the extreme right, Alfred Hugenberg, Minister of the Economy and Agriculture, an aggressive and authoritarian hardliner. Hitler called his government the Cabinet of National Concentration, to make it sound like a national coalition rather than a predominantly Nazi government. This reactionary body believed it could control Hitler. Von Papen made a dreadful mistake when he said to Hugenberg, "Hitler is our man," to which Hugenberg replied, "We oversee him." That very evening, the 30th of January 1933, in Berlin and all the other large German cities, Goebbels organized a torchlight parade of the Steel Helmet Veteran Group, the SS, and at the front, the SA stormtroopers. Goebbels declared that 1 million people marched in the parade, but the British military attaché estimated them at less than 15,000 marchers, made to go around in circles for hours by Goebbels. They passed under the windows of the 85-year-old President Hindenburg, who, believing himself to be in Verdun in 1916, said to his aide, "Our men are parading well. They've taken many prisoners." Hitler, at the Chancellery, received the frenzied tribute. A Berlin schoolteacher looked on and said, "I heard people shouting, 'Death to the Jews! Jewish blood will gush under the knife.'" Goebbels concluded, "It's like a fairy tale." But this fairy tale did not have a happy ending. In February 1933, at the Berlin Sports Palace, Hitler delivered his first speech as Chancellor. What was Hitler's plan? Was he still after absolute power? There were still 200 communists and social democrats in the Reichstag. So Hitler's first move was to dissolve parliament and call new elections. His speech, filmed and broadcast on radio, was an appeal to all voters, even those on the left.
Und keine felsenfeste Überzeugung, dass eben doch dann einmal die Stunde kommt, in der die Millionen, die uns heute verfluchen, hinter uns stehen und mit uns begrüßen werden dann das gemeinsam geschaffene, wiedererkämpfte, wiedererworbene, neue deutsche Reich der Größe und der Ehre und der Kraft und der Herrlichkeit.
With this relatively conciliatory speech, Hitler continued to advance wearing a mask. Goebbels, however, wanted to stress the fundamentals, anti-Semitism and violence, for the Nazi voter base.
Und wenn die jüdischen Zeitungen heute glauben, auf versteckte Drohungen die nationalsozialistische Bewegung einschüchtern zu können, sie sollen sich hüten. Einmal wird unsere Geduld zu Ende sein und dann wird den Juden das freche Lügenmaul gestopft werden. Im Übrigen können unsere Parteigenossen des A-Männer auch darüber beruhigt sein, dass eher als wir alle denken, die Stunde des Endes des roten Terrors gekommen sein wird. Und wir werden den Herren vom Karl-Liebknecht-Haus bald Töne beibringen, die sie noch niemals vernommen haben.
Only 2 weeks later, in Berlin, the Great Reichstag, the German Parliament building, burned down in the night. Nothing was left of the most powerful symbol of German democracy. The investigation carried out by the police under Göring arrested a 24-year-old Dutch communist named Marinus van der Lubbe. He was charged with arson. Quickly found guilty, he was executed. But it was the Nazis who were able to profit from this crime. Hitler and Göring raised the spectre of a red plot. Göring had 4,000 communists arrested, including all the party leaders. But the Communist Party wasn't outlawed yet. For Hitler wanted to maintain the appearance of legality for the elections which he expected would consolidate his power. The Germans, fed up with election campaigns and disorder, witnessed scenes of the stormtroopers in action all over the country to protect the population from communist attacks, as the Nazis put it. There were over 1 million stormtroopers. Now armed, they had the status of auxiliary police officers. Across Germany, they took up positions in front of the headquarters of leftist parties and workers' unions. Once again, they fomented violence, while Hitler continued to play the electoral card to reassure an increasingly exhausted President Hindenburg. Goering, in his Gothic-style armchair, fingering his dagger, gave the official, doctored version of the election outcome.
Der 5. März bedeutet für einen Mann und eine Bewegung einen gewaltigen Sieg. Der Sieger des 5. heißt Adolf Hitler und die Bewegung ist der Nationalsozialismus. Beides aber ist gleichzusetzen mit dem deutschen Volke und dem Deutschen Reich.
In reality, Hitler and his coalition had barely won a majority. Even with all his propaganda and the intimidation by the SA, Hitler hadn't prevented the communists from obtaining 12% of the votes. At this point, with his government behind him, Hitler tore off the mask of respectability and crossed the line to illegality. He invalidated the election of the communist parliamentarians and had them arrested and sent to the concentration camps of Oranienburg near Berlin and Dachau near Munich, which had just been built by the Nazis. These were the first of 16 camps that opened in 1933 alone. The number of political prisoners rose to 100,000 during the first months of the regime. A communist student recalled, "The guards whipped the prisoners and pushed us into freezing water. We always feared for our lives, night and day." The Nazi version was that these parliamentarians, senior civil servants and union leaders were all being re-educated. The shadow of dictatorship began to spread across Germany. Since the Reichstag had burned down, Hitler staged the new parliament in the Royal Opera House, surrounded by the SA, and demanded unlimited powers. The communist members were not there. Most were in the camps. The 94 Social Democrats who were still present managed to summon up the courage to vote against Hitler. But they too were arrested and sent to the camps, or forced to flee the country. 441 members from the extreme right to the Catholic centre listened to Hitler's long, rambling speech intended to bolster people's illusions. As always, he promised the earth, the end of unemployment, relief for peasant farmers, respect for the law, and above all, peace. The Assembly then voted for its own demise by granting Hitler full powers for 4 years. No longer could President Hindenburg challenge the Chancellor's decisions. To the sound of cheering, democracy died in Germany. The fact that Hitler, whose power was based on anti-Semitism, now led one of the world's most advanced industrialized countries was seen as a universal threat. Next, Hitler ordered a day-long boycott of Jewish-owned stores in Germany, meant as a warning. An amateur filmmaker, with the assistance of his wife, tested the determination of the Nazis posted in front of Jewish-owned businesses. Jews in Germany were horrified to see SA posters that read, "Not a penny for Jewish capitalism, buy German," and "The Jews are the cause of our downfall." It was the beginning of the era of persecution. Anti-Semitism even contaminated the universities. Nazism was perverting the minds of young students, turning them against modern culture, imposing an intolerant ideology that would lead the students themselves to burn books, with the help of school children and directed by stormtroopers all over the country. They gathered works from libraries, bookshops, and publishing houses that reflected what Hitler described as an un-German spirit. On the Nazi blacklist were authors like Karl Marx, Sigmund Freud, Stefan Zweig, and 300 others, mainly Jewish or communist writers. 12,000 titles were condemned. Hundreds of thousands of copies were to be burnt, and the stormtroopers prepared the pyres. In a radio broadcast from Berlin's Opera Square, Goebbels read out the Sermon of the Black Mass for a ritual straight out of the Dark Ages.
Meine Kommilitonen, deutsche Männer und Frauen, das Zeitalter eines überspitzten jüdischen Intellektualismus ist nun zu Ende. Und der kommende deutsche Mensch wird nicht nur ein Mensch des Buches, sondern auch ein Mensch des Charakters sein.
A young Berliner was present at the Nazi burning of the books. She described the scene. The essay and the students shouted out the book's title and its author's name. They stated if the author was Jewish, a pacifist, a feminist, or simply a modernist. They would recite, "We consign you to the fire," and would throw the book into the flames. I was dumbfounded and deeply outraged, since we had read and discussed in class many of the works that ended up in the fire. Hitler had been able to take advantage of the disunity between his enemies. The Social Democrats were unwilling to support the Communists. And the Communists had received their orders direct from Moscow. There was to be no alliance with the Social Democrats, who were described as traitors. Stalin's suicidal orders were a gift to Hitler. Now he had outmaneuvered all his enemies. Step by step, Hitler was able to seize absolute power in Germany. After suppressing the unions on the 21st of July 1933, he outlawed the Social Democratic Party.
Die große Zeit ist jetzt angebrochen. Deutschland ist nun erwacht. Die Macht haben wir nun in Deutschland gewonnen. Nun gilt es, das deutsche Volk zu gewinnen.
The German people, for their part, went away on holiday. Now the Nazi Party was the only legal party. Its anti-Semitic slogans didn't appear to stir up many people. They seemed largely indifferent to the fate of their Jewish compatriots, who, after all, only numbered 500,000, less than 1% of the population. Half the German Jews would manage to emigrate. Gerda Blachmann remembered, "We succeeded in embarking on the condition of giving up everything we owned." The poorer German Jews would be stuck in Germany. They would be deported to the eastern ghettos and finally exterminated in the camps. Opponents to the regime would flee if they could. Many went to France, where they would later be trapped by the German occupation in the war. and handed back to the Nazis. But the vast majority of Germans would accept the totalitarian regime. Some would begin the day by hoisting the swastika flag, Germany's official emblem. Others, now that Hitler had muzzled the press, would read only Nazi newspapers. Their daughters, too, would learn the compulsory salute. Their sons would enter the Hitler Jugend, the Hitler Youth Movement, which would hone their aggressive tendencies. At school, teachers would show pupils how to handle weapons. Teachers would have to use down-to-earth Nazi-sanctioned examples in maths classes, such as, how much does a pupil cost? A mentally handicapped young person costs the state 1,800 marks a year, the average pupil 320 marks, and a brilliant pupil only 125 marks. Answer: society can only survive if its citizens are genetically sound. The older daughters would join the BDM, the Bund Deutscher Mädel, the League of German Girls. It trained girls to be good wives and to bear many little soldiers. But Hitler was not yet the unchallenged supreme leader. He still had to promote himself and his party through propaganda films like Victory of Faith, on the first rally since the taking of power by the Nazi Party, now the only party. Hitler was well served by the talents of the young film director Leni Riefenstahl, who charmed him with her energy and beauty. With brilliant photography and lighting techniques, she glorified the new god. She gave him a new mystique, the mystique of the leader, of power, which also elevated his apostles like the most loyal of the loyal, Rudolf Hess, one of the writers of the anti-Jewish laws. Like Joseph Goebbels, under whom propaganda had become an important ministry. Like Hermann Goering, who had revived German aviation. And like Ernst Röhm, head of that horde of fanatics, the Stormtroopers. No one could have imagined that this film would be banned a year later, because Röhm, even though he had been Hitler's accomplice since the failed putsch of 1923, was to be denounced as a traitor. Partly because he was too close to Hitler, partly because the SA had grown too big. With 2 million members, it began to rival the army. Hitler, to gain the army's support, would have to bring them into line and eliminate Röhm. In the summer of 1934, Hitler observed the maneuvers of the German army, reduced by the Treaty of Versailles to 100,000 men, few in number, but well trained. Hitler knew that to wage war, he needed good generals, admirals, brilliant officers, great strategists, and well-drilled soldiers. He had always promised to free the army of the straitjacket of Versailles and to restore its troop and weapon strength. But the generals wanted more, in particular to get rid of Röhm and his stormtroopers, who were in a position to supplant the army. Röhm was also harshly criticized for having delusions of grandeur. Was he trying to set himself up as a rival to Hitler? Rome's SA rallies were looking more and more as though he was trying to steal the limelight. Hitler and Rome had been partners for 15 years, but Hitler did not hesitate. He would eliminate Rome under the pretext that he was planning a coup d'etat. Hitler then chose his executioners: Himmler, head of the SS, Heydrich, head of the Gestapo, Sepp Dietrich, who led the Führer's bodyguard. Between the 30th of June and the 2nd of July 1934, a period that Hitler called the Night of the Long Knives, the SS murdered Rome and 85 other potential opponents and embarrassing witnesses of Hitler's past. With Rome gone, the stormtroopers lost all their influence and were deployed only to keep order. The army was satisfied, as were the industrial barons. Sepp Dietrich was promoted an SS general. When Leni Riefenstahl directed her next film, Triumph of the Will, on the Nazi Party rally of 1934, only black SS uniforms were seen, marching behind Himmler. Hitler was now alone at the top of the pyramid. A month after the Night of the Long Knives, the last president of the Republic, Marshal Hindenburg, died, aged 87. Democracy had been dead and buried for a long time. Germany continued its march towards totalitarianism. Hitler now became commander of the armed forces. His power was finally absolute. Every soldier had to swear an oath of loyalty to the Führer, our leader, and the leader of the German people, Adolf Hitler. Hitler and the Nazis were good at taking credit for the successes of the Weimar Republic, such as the famous autobahns, which became showcases for the Nazi regime. Next, Hitler and his cohorts would strike by passing the Nuremberg race laws, denying basic human rights to all Jews. He would burn synagogues to the ground in Kristallnacht, a prelude to the final solution. He would violate the Treaty of Versailles by reoccupying the zones demilitarized in 1919. The weakness shown by the lack of reaction from Britain or France would lead Mussolini to draw closer to Hitler, allowing him to annex Austria, the next step in what he called his mission, to integrate all the German-speaking peoples into a greater Germany. He would intervene in the bloody Spanish Civil War, sending his bombers to annihilate the population of Guernica. Ensuring victory for Franco's fascists over the Spanish Republicans. He dreamt of a great army, like Napoleon's, one that he would lead to Moscow, all the while proclaiming his desire for peace.
Wir wollen einst ein Reich sehen, und ihr müsst euch schon dafür erziehen. Wir wollen, dass dieses Volk einst gehorsam ist, und ihr müsst euch in den Gehorsam üben. Wir wollen, dass dieses Volk einst friedliebend und aber auch tapfer ist, und ihr müsst friedfertig sein.
The German people, drained by Nazi pomp and propaganda, would begin to lose contact with reality. When Germany was ready, Hitler, obstinate and ferocious, would drag it and
porträtt av